56 days after Kazakhstan declared a national state of emergency due to the COVID-19 spread, government is easing movement restriction measures. Now, this is the first time I left home for work in about 7 weeks, with an exception of grocery shopping. Today, I will be meeting the country director for Kazakhstan of the Asian Development Bank, Giovanni Capannelli, to discuss the economic crisis looming over the country. Mr. Capannelli, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for coming, Lyazzat. It's a pleasure having you here.
Good to see you. Mr. Capannelli, I wanted to start with the oil market crash because it's affecting Kazakhstan's economy. Earlier in March, the Kazakh government has forecasted that the oil exports will drop by $16 billion this year to $35 billion. Just yesterday, the government actually announced that it will be cutting the oil exports and oil production because of the OPEC Plus agreement. And Kazakhstan is really reliant on its oil exports. This will cause a significant budget deficit. How will this affect the economic development in Kazakhstan?
Well, you see, this issue that Kazakhstan is facing currently with the plummeting in oil prices obviously sums up to other ongoing major crises like the pandemic being generated by the health sector, as well as this shortage of capital inflows in the country. So it's amplified the implications on the economy. Obviously, this is something that Kazakhstan has been dealing with a number of years, trying to diversify its economy out of this heavy dependency on hydrocarbons, oil and gas specifically. And I really hope that this is the right time for introducing deep structural reforms in the economy of Kazakhstan, which will make it really more resilient as oil prices are so volatile and plummeting. And it will be some reforms that will enable the country really to move on a different path of economic development. You talk about oil prices, in WTI, for example, a few days ago, we experienced for the first time ever, negative pricing, especially in the forward contracts. That is something that was never experienced. The government last year in September, when the government introduced a budget for the country for 2020, at that time, it forecasted like average price of oil in 2020 around $55. And then we saw what happened since March. And now, it's really unstable. I think the government has little to do against this because these are external shocks. And Kazakhstan receives that. Obviously, following this OPEC Plus agreement and following restrictions, limitations in the production is something that it has to do, but eventually is so dependent on external conditions, and therefore this reflects heavily on the fiscal balance of the country, and government needs to introduce a number of policy measures to face the situation and strengthen the economy moving forward.
We will come back to the measures that the government can introduce in response to the crisis. I'd like to talk to you about the tenge devaluation. Tenge has devalued for about 15% in the past a month and a half. What does this mean for an average Kazakh citizen in their daily lives?
You see, this is unfortunately nothing new to Kazakhstan. The devaluation of the tenge has been happening over the past 10 years quite constantly whenever external shocks hit the country. And what are the implications? Obviously, the implications is that imports will become much more expensive than before. Foreign travels for people to go and enjoy traveling abroad will be much more expensive. At the same time, there are some competitiveness advantages as well, because exports of Kazakhstan will become cheaper and it will be a more attractive tourist destination once all this COVID-19 pandemic will be over. However, all in all, for foreign investors, this is bad news because whenever they want to invest in Kazakhstan, this high volatility in the exchange rate means that whenever they want to repatriate their profit, their prospects are, not as good as they will be in case of stable currency trend. And therefore, this is something that authorities need to deal with. Actually, I would like to say that the central bank did the right thing in immediately, increasing its policy rate from 9.25% to 12% for a short period of time. That helped a lot, calming down in foreign investors and limiting these negative implications on the devaluation of the tenge. Then it was able to lower back policy rate to 9.5% to allow that injection of liquidity in the economy that is so much needed. So I think the central bank is doing the right action, is also able to limit the extent of what we call dollarization of the economy. However, I repeat, I believe structural reforms are really needed, not only to face a short-term situation, but to improve the economy, structural reforms that will be able to strengthen and increase the resilience of the economy in the medium-long term.
Now, in the past 15 years, there has been several external shocks that have actually shook the Kazakh economy, which is the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis, whether it's 2015 oil price plunge as well. And we've seen Kazakhstan's economy contracting amidst these global events. And this is happening again. And Kazakhstan has been talking about diversification for a while. It hasn't seemed to actually achieved its goal, and it's going to be a long-term effort. So what are some of the economic structural reforms that you mentioned about that Kazakhstan should be implementing at the time?
You see, when crisis hit a country like Kazakhstan or any country, now policymakers have to face a big challenge, what to do in terms of measures. Usually they can divide their action into short-term and medium-long-term. And they must be aware that, sometimes crises are not necessarily bad news. The danger that is inherent, with the economic shocks is really something that governments and authorities need to face in the short term. But together with that danger, there is also an opportunity for improving the system. And that's where I think medium to long-term structural reforms are needed for Kazakhstan. I would like to say that you rightly mentioned these external shocks hit the economy in 2008, 2009, 14, 15, and now again. I think, in a way, if I may say, Kazakhstan lost two important opportunities of structural reforms. Before, it has focused on introducing counter-cyclical programs to strengthen infrastructure investment, and then recently also has been improving quite a lot the situation with social transfers to the population and improve living conditions also in the rural areas and the countryside. However, that's not obviously enough. Perhaps this is the time that Kazakhstan, instead of only focusing on the economy, should first look back and think that political, institutional, governance reforms are needed. And that's where I think, to have a long-lasting effect on the economy, you need to act on, promptly and deeply now. So that means basically try to move away from the old business model into a new business model where competition and markets are preferred vis-a-vis, the solution of introducing, looking at plans and programs like in the old-style Soviet Union. Still, there is a little bit of that heritage in Kazakhstan that needs to be moved away. So focusing on markets is number one. Second, especially for government servants, there's a lot to improve in the provision of public services, and that means moving away from the patronage system, which is already there, and this importance of connections, affiliation to some families or political parties, and improving towards meritocracy. So introduce a system that really favors merit over relationship, I think is something very important for Kazakhstan. At the same time, you see, this is very much a vertical structure in terms of the society. Everybody refers to his or her boss, but it's very rare that you find incentives in coordinating horizontally. So that change also has to happen. Introducing an incentive system that also provides more space for individuals to express themselves and be able to contribute to some kind of teamwork. In terms of economic policy, that means, for example, not only relying on government, but also bringing in academia, bringing in the private sector, and forming some kind of groups that advise policymaking. So institutional reforms, improving governance, political system, even giving more power to the parliament and allowing members in the parliament to be elected by the people in a more transparent way, I think is something very important. So these institutional reforms are very much needed. Then you can look at economic reforms and social sector reforms, and we can elaborate on those if you like.
To me, that also calls for a change in educational system, in the change management, but also attraction of younger experts, perhaps younger decision makers, and having them at a table.
Well, you see, you're mentioning a very important aspect, young people and the dynamism that they have and they can introduce into making changes. Whenever you want to introduce structural reforms, you always need champions. Without champions, you cannot introduce that kind of reform. So obviously, you still need to look into the old guard, strong persons who have experience and are motivated, dedicated to reforms. So those people are important, but they have to be paired and matched with young, dynamic people. Many of those, I think, are now abroad. Kazakhstan has to call them back. And you are a female, and I think a lot is in the female, is in women. Kazakhstan, there are no issues, I guess, in Kazakhstan with regard to, gender and so on. I never see that as a major problem. But still, if you look at decision makers, if you look at the way how, not only government is composed and so on, it's kind of male-dominated. So what I see, my experience, I travel around the world and I have a lot of Kazakh female friends. And I see some of them, many of those actually, who are now holding important decision-making position in many institutions or companies around the world, needed to be brought back and contribute by serving the country to structural reforms. So education, it's part of, that you mentioned, it's part of a broader need for strengthening human capital.
Well, speaking of women in decision-making roles, Kazakhstan is actually, according to the World Economic Forum, Kazakhstan is 200 years away from gender economic parity. So that's a dire picture, and I really hope to see more female leaders in Kazakhstan, but that doesn't seem to represent the actual picture just yet.
Well, we share that hope. We share that hope, and that's what I'm trying to my point is that that's the time for change. That's a time for reforms. That's a time for strengthening the opportunities, focusing on the opportunities that crises always bring together with the danger. So if not now, when? That's the question.
Businesses have been hit hard by the coronavirus crisis. There's a forecast that 30% of the micro businesses in Kazakhstan will never be able to recover from the crisis. The government has introduced some of the support measures like tax holidays, like excise tax exemptions, like delayed income declarations. Have these measures been enough? What else could the government be doing at this time?
You see, that's completely correct. I believe in situations like this, government has to do whatever it takes to make sure that the economy remains resilient as much as possible. So you're talking about a number of measures that the government has introduced for small and medium enterprises, macro enterprises, individual entrepreneurs, to inject liquidity, to let them, defer some of the payments, and these are working. Although I think the devil is in the detail, and it's a little bit too early to tell you exactly if these measures are already working. The implementation mechanisms, the way how secondary banks are de facto then, allowing small and medium enterprises to increase their lending at, now there is a program of 1 trillion tenge that the, central bank has been put together at the capped 6% interest rate. That's fine, but it goes through the banking system. And to what extent banks will be able, to provide those kind of loans to small and medium enterprises that are guaranteed by the government, the implementation mechanism, the transmission mechanisms are also very important. But your point is completely correct. those that are most hit by the crisis are small and medium enterprises. These are mostly in the service sector, logistics, and these are areas which are being hardly hit by this social distancing and state of emergency measures. So these SMEs are disproportionately hit by the crisis. And then you see a reflection of that in the employment. I've seen a few surveys, some done by Atomic Yen and others, looking at prospects for employment, and 48% or 50% of the employees have been laid off. And so now it's a big issue for the government introducing measures that help SMEs but also help with maintaining social cohesion. Families, individuals are being hit by the crisis, but after a while they will realize that there are very few prospects in front of them, and if the government doesn't intervene properly, that may induce also some kind of social unrest. And this especially so in the rural areas, in the countryside. And so, for example, we've been working together with government and other development partners for introducing what we call a solidarity fund. A solidarity fund looks into the most vulnerable part of the population, those that are more hardly hit by this combined crisis. And first of all, tries to help providing this material relief to a lot of the families of these individuals. These are in the supply chains of food, medicines, and all that. Of course, there are a number of funds, agencies which are already working on that, but we are trying to complement what others are already doing, and we are working closely with different ACIMATs at the local level to channel this material relief to the population there.
Well, it's great to hear the efforts about the efforts of the ADB in regard to fighting the crisis and helping the population go through it and come out of it. Well, what government has done are the cash reliefs distributed among the population that are economically disadvantaged. It's in the amount of 42,500 tenge per month, which is an equivalent of $90. But I think the crisis has actually shown how economically vulnerable the majority of the population really is, how there's lack of savings, there's lack of personal savings for crisis, there's lack of financial education among the population. Do you think this crisis will change our economic behaviors and the way we look at our safety net after the crisis?
Definitely, you're completely right. And definitely this crisis is changing the way how people look at their financial resilience in general. And now, as you say, they realize that the system here is not particularly conducive of, being able to weather situations like this one. If it is a short period of time, 1 week, 2 weeks, maybe people can do that. But, there are some, now what we realize, there are some fundamental aspects of, you're talking about the financial sector, that needs to be improved. So non-banking sector, it's an area that really needs to develop. You're talking about insurance. Insurance is relatively underdeveloped. There's a great deal of work to do together with the central bank for improving, deepening, widening this non-banking financial sector like insurance, leasing, microfinance. These are all areas where a lot of improvements are expected. So there is a great deal of role that authorities have to play in trying to, but also communication, I think, is very important, because people sometimes, and I think this is an area where the government may need to improve a little bit in, continuously informing the population of, the evolving situation and what the government is doing for them, taking them hand by hand, not only with, top-down structure, but sometimes grassroots approach, a bottom-up, and working with local communities, to help understand how, issues about savings, for example, and the feeling of being insured against a crisis like this can improve. It's a complex, obviously, task for everyone, and this is not only Kazakhstan facing this situation. I'm Italian, and in Italy, we are, the country is facing even deeper challenges, I would say, than Kazakhstan. So this is a time for reflection for the global economy, and I hope that eventually kind of an upgraded system from capitalism where we are now will be eventually taking shape. And this idea of solidarity, I think it's important. The idea also of protecting the environment. You see, one thing that people have learned is not only about their resilience, but also that now nobody goes out for, now we've been here, I've been out in my house for maybe 1.5 months, not going out except for grocery. But like me, everybody else, has been at home. And now you see how, the environmental situation is improving. Absolutely. So we have to remind that Mother Nature is, has a lot of lessons for us. And so the new economy is also an economy where this empathy with regard to other people, with regard to the environment will be, I think, taking a higher position in the values that we give, to our economic decisions eventually.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Capannelli. This has been very insightful.
Thank you very much for coming. My pleasure. Thank you.